And as I said last night when I was talking to the dinner here, I'm always very pleased to get back to the island. My great-grandmother came from near Surrey, a little place called New Zealand, and for a couple of generations the Hanlons in New Zealand and the Buckles from Cornerook used to travel back and forth during the summer times, and I used to hear my grandmother talking about spending time down in Surrey, New Zealand, in her youth. And in fact, the reason why I am a graduate of St. Dunstan's is because of my island great-grandmother. When it came time to go to university, it was impressed upon me that there was a university over here and that it was much better than the one in St. John's. And I think they were true. Just going to grab some water here. Well, what I'm going to talk about tonight is the whole business of the Great Famine, which this year is marked by its 150th anniversary of the beginning of the famine in 1845. And the general, I think, mythology that people run by sometimes in the whole of Atlantic Canada is that most of us who are of Irish descent here are here as a consequence of the Great Famine. And nothing could be farther from the truth, in fact, because most people of Irish descent, certainly in a line which you could draw between, say, the Miramichi and Halifax across the Maritimes, everything east of that line, or I shouldn't say everything, but say something like 80 or 85% of it, including Newfoundland, the descendants of the Irish in that region came here in some instances 100 years before the Great Famine, but most certainly by 20 or at least 15 or 20 years before the Great Famine itself. And the only part of the Maritimes which really received any large influx of people from the famine is the southern areas of New Brunswick, St. John and St. Andrews, that area. And quite considerable, of course, was the migration to St. John from the famine, and the most savagely affected parts of Ireland by that famine, the northwestern and southwestern parts of the island, which were most severely hit by the famine, especially in 1847. In any case, what I wanted to do tonight is to talk about two periods, in a sense: the period before the famine, when our immediate forebears would have been living in Ireland, and the period immediately after the famine, in which tremendous change was effected in Irish social, political, economic life, to the point where the Ireland of, say, the 1870s would practically be unrecognizable from what it was 30 or 40 years before. Now, the 18th century in Ireland, a number of things to get clear about before going ahead. That is, up until 1801, any references you'll see to Ireland in documentation refers to the Kingdom of Ireland, because up till that time, Ireland was a separate political unit from Britain. It shared a common king or queen who sat in London, but it was a separate kingdom. It had its own parliament in College Green in Dublin, and it was quasi-independent of the parliament in London. I say quasi-independent because it was in many respects linked in with what's now called Great Britain, but it did have a separate political existence. And in fact, in the latter part of the 18th century, during the time of Grattan, the Irish Parliament almost succeeded in severing itself completely from the Parliament in London. Events which we don't need to go into as a consequence of the economic history of Ireland at the end of the 18th century, one of which, of course, was the Great Rebellion, the Great Rising, mainly in County Wexford in 1798, meant that the English Parliament and English parliamentarians decided that the best thing to do in order to solve the difficulties being encountered in Ireland primarily by the upper middle class and middle class Catholics in terms of their civil rights, which they never were able to succeed in convincing a Protestant-dominated Parliament in Dublin in granting them, was to unite the Parliament in Dublin with the Parliament in London. How that was effected would require several lectures in its own right, but that happened in 1801, that the Parliament in College Green voted itself out of existence, and in fact, I think I'm correct in saying that several million pounds changed hands in buying the votes to effect that. A number of viscountships and things were granted to people, and in order to bribe the votes sufficient to get it to be done. That was a Protestant Parliament because in the aftermath of the religious changes that took place in the British Isles in the 16th century, the coming into being, for instance, of the church as by law established, better known as the Anglican Church, or in Ireland later on as the Church of Ireland, that Protestantization of large chunk of the population in England was, resulted in a number of penal laws been put on the books in Ireland once the conquest by Ireland had been more or less effected in the late 16th, early 17th century. Ireland had to be reconquered all the time. If you read Irish history, there's this whole business. Elizabeth starts doing it, and as one of my Irish colleagues in Cork used to say, every Irishman who came here to do it, he said, found himself sinking deeper and deeper into the bog, you see. And they had to get another troop over to pull them out of the bog, you see, and when they came, another troop. So you had this whole business of reconquering, and just as a kind of an aside to the whole thing, what was England's interest in it? What was the whole business of why they were coming over there? And pretty largely, it had to do with something which exists in the British mind, the British, if you can think of such a thing, in the kind of political frame of thought that was there, that there was threat to England from the west, from the its western flank had this group of uncouth people living there who were treacherous and vile, and whom you didn't know at any stage what exactly they were going to do. There's a marvelous line in Macbeth, Shakespeare's Macbeth, where he talks of kerns and gallowglasses from the Western Islands. And the kerns and gallowglasses were the Irish mercenary troops who, in that play, were doing things in Scotland, but they could just as easily, in the British mind, do it to them. And so there was this kind of apprehension, even as late as Margaret Thatcher. Margaret Thatcher said that Ireland was an existent threat to British security. And it's a very old preoccupation with Ireland. In any case, they came, uninvited, but they did come, and they came constantly until by 1690 they had pretty well effected a regime in Ireland whereby the old Irish aristocracy, who were, if you look at it quite coldly, no better, I suppose, and no worse in terms of their relationship to the majority of the population than any aristocracy, than the British or the Russian or any other group would have been. But at least they were Irish, and they did maintain an Irish culture. But in the aftermath of the 1690s, the bulk of the Irish aristocracy were either displaced, had their lands taken from them, and emigrated. Countless hundreds of them going into exile in France, and anybody who knows anything of the 18th century in Europe will recognize, for instance, names like General Taft in the Russian army, General O'Donnell in the Army of Spain, and as late, for instance, as the 19th century, Marshal MacMahon, the President of France, whose great-grandfather had come to France from Ireland. So that was there, and in fact, I forgot one, Hennessy brandy. The Hennessy's, Mike, went over and married into the levels of the petty bourgeoisie and the semi-aristocracy of France, and went into business. And in fact, in the Bordeaux country to this day, you have some 12 chateau wines, which have the strange names like Chateau Kerwin, Chateau McCarthy, Chateau Phelan, Chateau Lange Bauge, Lynch is the name. But you have that whole, and of course farther up you get the Hennessy's. So that was that group sort of went over to Europe and left the bulk of the population in Ireland practically leaderless. They had very few natural leaders to whom they turned, and in the 18th century they turned more and more to the few ecclesiastics who were around, and to the middle class in the towns, in Dublin, Waterford, Wexford, Cork. In those places, there was in a sense, no natural aristocratic leadership who could fend for them in the wilds of the period, and they were made to be tenants on the lands that, in many instances, had been occupied by their forebears as owners of that land. And just to sort of clarify a few things in terms of land ownership, land holdership in Ireland, you had 3 or 4 thefts, I might say, of the lands in Ireland. You had the big one, of course, that took place, the plantations in Ulster in the end of the 17th century, the beginning of the 17th century. And again, curiously, a nice continental connection is the fact that, for instance, the McCartans, well, there are any McCartans here, but the McCartans had their lands taken from them by the antecedents of a man whose name you probably can remember from about 15 years ago, Chichester Clark. Chichester Clark was the Prime Minister of what was then Northern Ireland, and his ancestor, Chichester, had taken the Antrim glens from the McCartans. And the McCartans, for generations in succession, never recognized the theft of their lands, and they passed them on in wills every generation. The lands were passed on and passed on, and in 1962 or 63, when de Gaulle lost power in France, he and his wife Claude made a trip, the only trip he made out of France in quite a long while, and he went to Ireland. And he went up to Northern Ireland to see the glens of Antrim that had at one time been willed to his great-grandmother, who was a McCartan. So he was quite aware of his Irish antecedents. So it's again one of these curious links that you had with, with France from the 18th century. Now, the lands, you had a number of Catholic landowners in Ireland who survived into the 18th century. The Martins, some of the Butlers, and in fact the reason why in the southeastern counties of Ireland Catholics were relatively free almost throughout the whole of the 18th century and before was the fact that the Butler family, whose premier duke was the Duke of Ormond, who was a Protestant, but all of the junior branches of that family, who were the part of the Irish aristocracy, were Catholics. Lord Dunboyne, for instance, was a Catholic. And most of the junior branches of the family up to the Shure Valley. And it was very difficult, for instance, for people to, sort of, the Duke of Ormond couldn't very well operate against his Protestant cousin, or his Catholic cousins. So you had relative security in that area. with respect to the imposition of the odious penal laws. Now, you've all, I'm sure, heard about the penal laws, and I'll talk about them in a minute. But first of all, I want to just talk about the land system of land tenure itself. The land was held by several thousand landowners. There were probably about 30 or 40 huge landowners. And then you had a succession of smaller landholders, many of whom were the descendants of Cromwellian soldiers who had been given lands that had been taken from the Irish when they were transplanted. You had the remnants of the army of William of Orange. You had a whole series of placemen who were taken over from various parts of the British Isles, some from Scotland, some from England, some from Wales, excuse me, and they were given the lands that had formerly been held by the Irish. And if you look, for instance, it's quite easy, for instance, in Petty's Survey of Ireland, to find out who owned the lands, for instance, before the Great Transformation. And you'll find, for instance, that the former owner is described in some instances, say, as William Power of Gortnacree, Irish Papist. And the lands now belong to William Carton of London. Just like that, the transformation took place. And those lands now were farmed out to these people. They owned them. And the vast bulk of the population held lands from them as tenants. They didn't own the land. And land ownership, or land, is absolutely the central focus of what I'm talking about here. In fact, during the 19th century, when Gladstone was Prime Minister of England, Gladstone was trying to put through a number of measures to bring relief to the whole system of difficulties that Ireland had gotten into as a consequence of the English conquest. And he had a good friend who was an Irish Monsignor in London, whom he used to talk with on a fairly regular basis to get some idea of what the Irish were all about. And he, at one time, asked him, or the story is told that he asked him, "Could you tell me, Monsignor," he said, "what is it?" He said, is there any one thing," he said, "that really sort of goes to the heart of the Irish question?" And the Monsignor answered him. He said, "Mr. Gladstone," he said, "if you cut an Irishman's heart in two," he said, "you'd find one word written in the center of it, L-A-N-D. And in fact, that was the whole, that really sort of, if you look at it, it really is the central feature of the whole business. Because land ownership, the Irish were always, in a sense, land hungry. And attachment to the land was something which went back aeons of time in Ireland to the whole almost mystical relationship there was to the land in the Irish mind. The whole business of sovereignty. If you look at, for instance, a number of the old Gaelic families' coats of arms, there are various symbols in them, and the symbols generally are symbols associated with sovereignty of the land, or obtaining sovereignty. And the sovereignty, of course, was attached to the land and place, where you came from. For instance, in the Irish language, if you look at some of the letters written in Irish by Hugh O'Neill, the great O'Neill, when he was on the continent of Ireland, he writes in Irish when he's signing his letters, "Ishmisha O'Neill, I am O'Neill, in the place where I am." And that was this whole business of place. And you tried as desperately as you could to hang on to your place, because your ancestors were there, your forebears. It was tied up with family names. All the field names were connected with people who were your immediate ancestors and your remote ancestors. And so for generations, for an Irish person to go into exile was next to death. And that's why, for instance, in the early part of the Christian missionization of Britain, Saxon Britain, and the continent of Europe in the 7th and 8th centuries and earlier, one of the things that the Irish missionaries did and saw as their duty was to go into exile. And the great St. Columbkille, he founded the monastery in Iona, of course, missionized and Christianized Scotland. The whole business of his life was, in a sense, one of exile. There was this kind of longing to be back in the tribal lands, and it was a kind of privation and punishment that they deliberately inflicted on themselves in the name, of course, of their Christian mission to exile themselves. And that preoccupation with where they had come from persisted as a tradition in the Irish, even though they might not have been able to articulate it to you. And so they tried to stay on the lands, so all during the 18th century, there was this whole business of tenant relationship with landlord in Ireland. It persisted really until the end of the 19th century in Ireland. And in the 18th century, you had the building up of a variety of classes. It was a very complex whole business in Ireland, the relationship of the bulk of the population, the Irish Catholic population, to lands which were in general, and again, you have to be careful about it because it is a generalization, there were Catholic landowners right till the end of the 18th century, but they were becoming fewer and fewer as the century wore on because of the pressure of the penal laws against them. The penal laws were enactments. There were two sets of penal laws. You had the penal laws of Great Britain and you had the penal laws of Ireland. Now, one of the interesting features of the penal laws of Great Britain, of England, was that the attendance at Mass under the English penal system was a penalty. It was a penalty for attendance at Mass. The Irish penal laws never had that, although mythology does tend to make it that way. There was no penalty ever attached in the Irish penal laws to attendance at Mass. It would have been ludicrous because, you know, people were going to go to Mass at some stage, and to make a law against it was fairly ludicrous. So that penal law didn't exist in Ireland. But there were all sorts of other ones which made it, for instance, more and more difficult for a great landowner to hold on to his lands. The Powers, for instance, who held lands in County Waterford for a number of generations, held them by a whole series of behind the back deals with their Protestant neighbors, who would hold lands for them and entail them. It was a lawyer's delight to go through that stuff, I'm sure, just to find out how you could wrangle the stuff out. But, for instance, if you were a Catholic landowner and one of your sons became a Protestant, he could disinherit you. And in fact, it did happen that this happened, that the father would be disinherited by the son who ascribed or subscribed to the 39 Articles. Now, quite frequently, this was done without any malice to the father. It was done to preserve the lands, because if the father died, he couldn't pass the lands on to, the lands couldn't be divided up. A Protestant finder, for instance, could come in and take the whole bundle from them. So quite frequently, one of the sons would, I suppose in Catholic terms, apostatize, and he would become a landowner, and for generations, they would have a sense in the family, for instance, that these lands held by them, they would take their cousins and their relatives in as tenants on the lands, and there was a kind of lèse-majesté back and forth between them. And you find particularly, for instance, in the southeastern counties of Ireland, people like the family name Ray, or the family name Innit, they had Protestant and Catholic lines of the family, and they worked almost hand in glove with one another to subvert the whole business of the penal laws. It's a very interesting kind of thing in itself. But eventually, what happened as a consequence of these lands, the way that the laws were written, over the period of, say, the 50 years between 1690 and about 1740, a tremendous number of the Catholic landowners who were left lost their lands, and you were getting less and less land in the holding of Roman Catholics. So that's one aspect of the situation. The other one, of course, was that in the leasing of lands, the penal system really had as its main goal the disenfranchisement of the Roman Catholics, and to make them no threat, no legal threat. They were disenfranchised from being members of Parliament, disenfranchised from running as mayors of towns, from standing to the bar, so that eventually, by the end of the century, by the end of the 18th century, the Catholics had, in Ireland, in 80% of the cases, been reduced to mere servitude on the land, even though they constituted the vast bulk of the population. Now, the complexity of the whole thing was in the towns like Dublin and Waterford, Cork, Limerick. During the 18th century, there was a gradual coming back of the Catholics because they weren't prevented from being in trade. So what you found, for instance, was that in the mercantile class of the 18th century, you had a growing number of very wealthy Catholics growing up. I mentioned last night, for instance, that the largest estate probated in Ireland in the 18th century was the estate of Edward Byrne, who was a sugar merchant in Dublin. He was a brother of the man who was the Catholic Archbishop of Dublin, and his estate was valued at over £100,000, which was an enormous amount of money in the 18th century. Lord Kerr's estate, for instance, only amounted to £10,000. So you had these fairly wealthy Catholic gentry growing up, and in fact, in the rural part of Ireland, they sometimes were wealthier, had more money, had more specie, more coin in their pockets than the people from whom they rented land. And as the century went on, you see, in the beginning years of the 18th century, the Parliament in Dublin made it very difficult for Catholics to hold leases of land for longer than 30 years. But as the century wore on, and there was less and less threat perceived by the ascendancy class, as that group of landowners was called, and land, of course, was power. That's the important thing about it. As the century wore on, leases for longer and longer periods were being granted to people. It was not uncommon, for instance, in the 1730s and 1740s to find leases of 99 years, sometimes 150 years. But 99 years was quite common as a lease for land, and then, of course, would be renewed at the when it would be near expiration. Now, I mentioned in the lecture last night, those of you who may have been here, the O'Callaghan family in Tipperary. They were a Catholic family, and they gradually, over the period of the 18th century, acquired huge holdings of land, which they held from owners of the land, like Lord Kerr, and they held it for leases of 99 years, and they sublet lands to farmers, big farmers, maybe owning or having leases of 400 or 500 acres of land, and then they in turn sublet those lands to smaller farmers, and the smaller farmers let it out to even smaller ones down the line. And the O'Callaghan's, by the end of the 1770s, had acquired a huge fortune of money because the money for the rent of those lands was being paid into them. And we find, for instance, in, I'm not sure the date, is 1765, one of the O'Callaghan's bought out a mortgage for Lord Kerr valued at £10,000. Lord Kerr didn't have the money himself, and he had to borrow it from his tenant. That's how complicated the whole situation gets in that period. And there were other Catholic families like that. The Mars in Tipperary, for instance, had similar kinds of holdings of land, not as large as the O'Callaghan's. Another Catholic family, the McCarthys, who straddled the Cork, Tipperary, Waterford border, they equally had large pieces of land, and they were Catholics. They would send their children, for instance, to be educated to France or to Spain, and they would come back to to live in Ireland. And of course the problem with life for educated Catholics of that period was they couldn't go anywhere. There was nowhere for them to go. They were like the Jews of Vienna in the 18th century, for whom, just like the Catholics in Ireland, all the professions were barred to them. So the Jews, like the Irish, or the Irish, like the Jews, went into money lending. And by the end of the 18th century, you read, for instance, in the Irish newspapers of the time, great warnings about all the money that the Roman Catholics hold in their hands, so that if they left with it, they would bankrupt the country. Quite literally, this was the apprehension. And here they were legally barred from all the professions, and yet they had this enormous amount of economic power, the middling powers of Catholics, especially in Dublin and the towns to the south. This was not so, for instance, in the north of Ireland, where the situation was quite different in terms of the way in which the land was held and the way in which the Catholics had been pretty largely subjugated to a fairly odious situation. So you had this whole system of land holding there. Now, our people, and I think I would be part of the whole class that you would be part of in terms of our ancestry, were down the bottom of this line of landholders, pretty generally. And as the century wore on, for instance, the 18th century wore on, one of the things you find is that the population starts to increase. Population of Ireland, say, about 1770, was somewhere between 4 and 5 million people, the whole country. As the century comes towards an end, and you can see this, for instance, in any of the Catholic parochial records that exist for that period, and there are a number of parishes, especially in the southeast of Ireland, where Catholic parish registers go back to the beginning of the 18th century, you'll see, for instance, that you have 1 or 2 books for maybe a 20-year period, 25-year period, up to about 1770. And then you find there's 4 books for a 10-year period. Baptisms, marriages, and the books get bigger, larger and larger number. Huge numbers of baptisms. And in fact, one of the things that's interesting about the Irish, despite the myth, for instance, of Irish poverty in that period, they had one of the lowest infant mortality rates in the whole of Europe. A lot of children were living, and it suggests to us something that again runs against the usual mythology, that the Irish were pretty well fed. Ireland is a good country to live in. It has good land, and things almost grow themselves there. And so you had good grazing land, you had good agricultural land all over the place, and so by the end of the 18th century, the population starts burgeoning. And of course, as it starts burgeoning, you start getting some inklings, even as early as the 1790s, of what's going to happen in 1745, 46, and 47. And as this population gets bigger and bigger, the part of the population that's increasing enormously, of course, as always is the case, are the poor, down at the bottom end of it. And down at the bottom end of the Irish population, you had a class of people called the cottiers. And in the 18th century, the cottier class would never have amounted to more than, say, 20 or 30% of the total population. But by the end of the 18th century, beginning of the 19th century, that population was beginning to go up towards more, like 50% of the population. Now, these were people who held maybe anywhere from 1 to 5 acres of land. And I would like to suggest to you, for instance, that it sounds as if 1 to 5 acres of land isn't a lot of land for a person to have and to live in some relative prosperity on. But in fact, all of the documentation from that period suggests that the cottier class of people at the end of the 18th century, beginning of the 19th century, lived in relative prosperity. descriptions, for instance, of the houses in which they lived would suggest, for instance, that although they had mud walls, and the mud wall cabin, of course, has always been suggested in the mythology of the post-famine period as being associated with poverty. Arthur Young, who was a great English agriculturalist and traveler in the 17th century, has made a tour through Ireland and describes the cabins of the cottager class as being relatively comfortable. They sometimes had one or two rooms in them, and even when you had only a one-room cabin, they were fairly spacious inside, and people could live in some relative prosperity. And the problem with all these concepts is, what's poverty? I mean, really, in a sense, how do you define poverty? I mean, for someone living, for instance, in what we might consider today to be relatively poor circumstances, by circumstance that time is like phenomenally rich and wealthy. And so, for instance, if people had a few pots and straw mattresses and that sort of thing, that would be considered to be a relatively well-off cabin for people to live in. They weren't starving. They lived. I mean, the diet, for instance, of the cottager and even sometimes the laboring class beneath that. And that's another aspect of the thing which I'll mention in a minute. But the diet of these people was relatively good. Arthur Young, for instance, says that the Irish peasant, and he's talking here largely of the cottager class people, that the Irish peasant going to bed at night with his belly full of buttermilk and potatoes is far better fed than his English counterpart going to bed with his belly full of cheese and bread. It's a much better diet. And in fact, nutritionists looking at the diet can attest to it. The way the potatoes were cooked, they were usually cooked very, very quickly up by the fire, the open hearth fire. You'd grab them out with your hands, glom them out, and split them and eat them, largely sometimes with some butter in them, and buttermilk. And of course, the potatoes, the skins of the potatoes were eaten as well, which were very high in vitamins. And the buttermilk itself was a very, very substantially rich food. And so when that situation existed at the end of the 18th century, supplemented occasionally by the odd chicken that you throw in the pot, or the slaughter of a pig which you may have kept during the year, they were not starving by any means. And they were relatively, as I say, well fed. The British Army, for instance, was quite aware of it. It was to Ireland they came to do their recruiting, because you'll find, for instance, in the English recruiting ledgers that the Irish men were of a higher stature and a bigger bulk than their English counterparts. Again, attesting to what Arthur Young was saying about this diet. Now, as you move into the 19th century, there were a number of economic problems that were beginning to face Ireland. There were all sorts of economic changes going on in the British Isles generally, and the laboring class. Now, the laboring class were the people below the level of the cottagers. The cottagers, for instance, had generally 1 to 5 acres of land which they held in leasehold. Now, the farther away you got from the top of that order, right? For instance, okay, you take your O'Callaghan types and McCarthy types at the top. They've got their maybe 2,000 or 3,000 acres, 4,000 acres of land, okay? And they sublet it out to others. Now, the subletting of these leases, for instance, the McCarthys may be holding it from Lord Kerr for a 99-year lease. And then beneath them, for instance, you may find the O'Hares renting probably 40 or 50 acres of land for 50 years. And the rent would be set. The rent, for instance, that Mr. O'Hare would be paying would be 5 shillings in the acre, something of this sort. Then you go to the next stage where Mr. O'Hare lets it out to Mr. O'Connor. And he's taking probably 15 acres, okay? 15, maybe 5 to 15 acres of land. And he's getting it for maybe life, which would be considered 30 to 33-year lease. And he would be getting his, for instance, at maybe the same rate, or maybe a little higher. Yeah? he may be paying 7 shillings to the acre for it. And then you come down, of course, to Mr. O'Connor, and he sublets some of his land to the cottiers. And he would let someone have it, for instance, for 5 years. Now, the problem was, of course, the rent was set at maybe 3 shillings an acre. He would rent his poorest land. You see, you're getting, when you get down to the cottier class, they're not getting the best land. They're getting the poorest land, and they're getting it at a cheaper rate, but it impinges upon them much more harshly than people who could pay it much better up at the top. And so he gets it for 5 years at, let's say, 3 shillings an acre. And then you had the pressures, for instance, of all that land being held in this fashion, that, for instance, if someone wants to take back some of the acreage, for instance, Mr. O'Connor wants to take some of those acres back that he's let out to his cottiers, he gouges them a bit more the next time. And so when their 5 years is up, he says, well, it's 7 shillings an acre, lads, this year. And you see, they were you still had these, the O'Callaghan's and people paying rents for 99 years which were set, eh? So the people who really were set upon in this whole situation were the people down at the bottom end, because they held it for much shorter leases of time, and the amounts of money they paid on it were, in some instances, quite staggering. And they made it just by, they wanted to have the land enough to grow a few spuds on, and that's when the potato really takes off as the major item of diet, is at the end of the 18th century and coming into the 19th century. The potato had always been there in Irish history, right from the time that they'd been brought in by Raleigh in the 16th century. But it wasn't until the 18th century, at the end of the 18th century, that the bulk of the population starts depending upon it as their sole means of subsistence. They would grow, for instance, if you were a cottier and you had 5 acres of ground, you might grow wheat and oats on it, which you would sell, and you had your little plot of potatoes, which were for yourself. And the wheat and oats, barley, the grains that you grew, they were to pay for the rent of the land and for whatever other things you may have needed, like tobacco and the odd drop of hot sheen and this sort of thing, and the pair of stockings for the little girl making her first communion, that sort of thing. Eh? That's the kind of thing. Now, beneath those, you're getting stretched out incredibly, but you had the landless poor, people who had no land. They might have been able to squat on some of the common lands and grow enough spuds to maintain themselves. And they may have been able to become spalpini, harvest workers. As the century grew on, for instance, the 1820s and 1830s, you find a lot of these landless poor going to England and Scotland to work as navvies, to do various kinds of laboring work, and then come home. And they, in turn, probably were helping their fathers or their families to maintain their 1 to 5 or maybe 10 acres of leasehold land. So you had, and these people, for instance, were sometimes driven by abject poverty. These were the people, for instance, who were the ragged beggars that the Loch Tane and these people saw in Ireland in that period. Now, you had periodic scarcity, especially at the end of the 18th and beginning of the 19th century, because of the press of people on the land. The population burgeoned, so that by the 1820s, the population in Ireland was 6 million. And it suggested, for instance, that the population, in order to be able to sustain itself relatively well, should have been somewhere around 4.5 million in terms of the agricultural capacity of the country at the time and the technology. But you're getting this 6 million population, and by the time the famine comes, it's nearly 9 million. And that's official statistics. We don't know for certain, for instance, if in those official statistics much of the landless class of people is even counted. So there could have been, for instance, in Ireland, that when the famine starts in 45, the population could have been as high. I mean, some people stretch it out to 10 million people. Enormous pressure on the land. Every little bit of land was being used. In fact, If you go down through the wealthier parts of Ireland today, for instance, wealthier land parts, I mean farming lands, and you go up on the sides of the mountains, sides of the hills, you'll see the little terraces where people went up to put potatoes in that period, say roughly the 1790s to the 1830s. You know, any little piece of land at all that they could get, they would use. Sometimes it was free land. But as the 18th century grew into the 19th century, you had a lot of the great landowners, because there was pressure on them because of the economic circumstances of the time to get more money. They were taking a lot of the land out of tillage and putting into pasturage. They were taking back more and more of the land to put cattle on it. And so cattle farming meant that there was even more pressure on the people down at the bottom end of the scale. There was less and less land for people to use for tillage. And so by the 1830s, you had probably every 5 or 6 years, you'd have periodic famines when people would go through great hunger, not always necessarily a lot of deaths, but great misery in the countryside as a consequence of these periodic famines. When you didn't have a particularly good harvest, you know, the potatoes didn't grow in any large amount because of the way the weather had gone. And you had some very large famines. You had, for instance, the Great Famine of 1816, when many of the people who came to Newfoundland and subsequently swept over into the Maritimes, into PEI, northern Nova Scotia, up along the shore up here and down into the Sydneys, a lot of those people came over following that famine of 1816, 1817, when there was a general the year with no summer, 1816. An island, I think the name of it was Krakatoa, blew up in the Pacific, and the dust from it obscured the sun sufficiently so that in Nova Scotia that year there wasn't a single month that they didn't have snow in. It snowed in June, July, and August. And people thought, my God, the end of the world is coming. You didn't have crops. You had great misery here and great misery in Ireland as well. Added to that, of course, you had the political downturn, political and economic downturn after the Napoleonic Wars, when people, for instance, in Ireland, many of them were soldiers in the British Army, earning the king's shilling, and that was being sent home. They were the kind of remittance men for their families. They were all demobbed. They came home, nowhere to go, no jobs. Formerly, for instance, when there was fairly good cattle droving and this sort of thing being done, there were all kinds of jobs for young fellows in the inland towns like Kilkenny and Dragnamana and this sort of thing, building barrels, because you see the cattle were slaughtered and salted and barreled and sent out. Firkins butter and things were being shipped down on barges down rivers like the Barrow and the Suir down to Port of Waterford. So there were lots of laboring jobs for these people during the period of the Napoleonic era, roughly from, say, the 1790s straight through till 1814. 1814, 1815, you get the demobilization, and in all of Western Europe, for the next 50 years, you had an economic depression, which was something to behold in itself. And when you had a large-scale emigration from places like southern Germany, Italy, you know, all the places that had been part and parcel of that old economy, they had to get out. So you started people migrating pretty largely to the United States, and of course this intensifies as the era wears on. In the Irish context, of course, population still burgeoning, and you're getting these periodic famines. Added to that, of course, is every year when the potatoes were running out, last year's potatoes were running out, the new potatoes were still not ready, and you had every year periodic periods of great misery and sometimes death as a consequence, because people were malnourished and they were subject to diseases like cholera and this sort of thing. You didn't have many cholera outbreaks before the Great Famine, but one of the things that did happen in the famine, of course, was cholera went rampant. And in fact, more people probably died from cholera than died from actual starvation during the period of the 1845 to 1850 famine. Now, you had, as a consequence of this sort of gradual buildup of population in the 1850 period, 1840 period, the pressure on the land, pressure to migrate was there, but a lot of people didn't. They still held on, as I mentioned early in the lecture. There was this business of hanging on to the last minute. You know, if you could hang on at all to where you lived, where your forebears had lived, you stuck to it. Now, in the when the famine starts in 1845, you had this huge population of people. You had some probably 2.5, 3 million people who may have been in the landless class. Again, we're not sure of numbers there, and the cottagers, and they would constitute the bulk of the population at that time, and they were solely dependent on the potato for their daily living. And when the potatoes failed in 45, the British government, when the Prime Minister was Pitt, and he was able to convince the English Parliament at the time, which of course had Irish members of Parliament under O'Connell, a subject we haven't really touched at all. The whole political movement was going on there. And they had sufficient relief brought into Ireland in 45 that there wasn't any large amount of death. There were deaths from the famine of that year, but it was a partial failure of the crop. Some areas were much harsher hit than others. The southeast of Ireland, where, for instance, there was still a great deal of tillage and wheat and barley and these things grown, you had far less suffering as a consequence than you had in places like Sligo and Leitrim, Mayo, the western counties, which were much more severely affected. Because of the kind of way the potato worked in Ireland as a crop, people figured, oh well, we've got through 45, we'll plant again 46, and we'll have a bumper crop. Well, of course, 46, the blight returns, and returns more seriously than it had been there in 45. There had been a change of ministry in the meantime. The Whigs came into power, and the Whigs believed in a number of the absolutes of Victorian ascendancy classes in the whole of Europe, especially in Britain. They believed in the sacrosanctity of the ownership of land, of absolute. You could not divest yourself of any land. Land was a sacred thing. It wasn't to be touched. People had to earn their living. So, for instance, Pitt, who had quite an experience of Ireland and knew the Irish situation, knew that in 45, for instance, what he had to do was get people fed. He knew they were starving. So you try to get grain in, and you just take as much of the bureaucratic obstacles to their getting fed out of the way. The Whig ministry had every bloody obstacle you can imagine put in the face of these starving people getting their hands on the grains. They also, for instance, made it incumbent on the people who owned the land, the Irish landowners, to be responsible for the payment for this thing. Now, the situation was that you say that's fair enough, but the landowners themselves, because of the situation generally, the great pressure that was on them, they were in bad situation. They didn't have enough money. They couldn't, in many instances, make the outlay to feed the peasants. They just didn't have the money. And there were many, many landlords. One of the worst aspects of the aftermath of the famine was the kind of attitude that the nationalists of the 1870s and 80s generally tarred the landowning class in Ireland with. Now, granted, there were an awful lot of really awful characters there in the landowning class, there's no question. But there were some people, landowners, who really made yeoman efforts to try to do something with the peasants to keep them from starving. And many smaller landowners went bankrupt, especially in 46 and 47. And more of them went bankrupt in the years after the worst period of the famine, because they went to bankruptcy court, they lost their lands. And as a consequence, for instance, of the way things went in that period from 46, I'll just read you a statistic. If you just think of what I'm looking at here. Census of 1841, okay, gives you the number. I'm going to read you out a gross number of people holding 1 to 5 acres of land, okay? It's 1841, 1 to 5 acres of land. The census of that period says that 330,436 people, individuals, now they would have families associated with that also, but this is the number of people who had holdings, leased holdings, of 1 to 5 acres. And they constituted 44% of all of the holdings in Ireland at that time. 44%. Okay? The famine comes. 1851 census. 1 to 5 acres of land. 88,000. 88,000. A drop from 330,000 to 80,000. And they're down now to 15.5% of the holders of land, population. You look at those holding 5 to 15 acres of land, okay? 1841, 252,799, okay? They represent 36.6%. So between 1 to 15 acres of land, you're looking at that in that period, almost 80% of the land of the persons holding that land, okay, being on the verge of extinction. Okay? In the 1851 census, that portion, the people holding 5 to 15 acres, is down to 190,000, a drop of over 100,000. Okay, and they represent now only 33.6% of those holding land, but still relatively holding. The big drop is in the 1 to 5. That's where the people really got nailed by the famine. Now, what happened as a consequence of this, just to give you an example of the kind of situation that the famine brought onto people, and I don't want to be over dramatic, but this is the description given by a Cork merchant, Catholic Cork merchant, going into Skibbereen in West Cork in December of 1846. He says, "I entered some of the hovels, and the scenes that presented themselves were such as no tongue or pen can convey the slightest idea of. In the first 6 famished and ghastly skeletons, to all appearance dead, were huddled in a corner on some filthy straw, their sole covering what seemed a ragged horsecloth, and their wretched legs hanging about naked above the knees. I approached in horror and found by a low moaning that they were alive. They were in fever. 4 children, a woman, and what it must have been a man." Difficult to read it, to realize the suffering that the famine entailed for people. And these scenes were repeated all over Ireland during, in fact, got worse in 47. And what was described there by that man coming from Cork in 46, you can just imagine the horror of these people, even if they were able to get out of the hovel and get on one of the coffin ships, as they were called, leaving and coming up to St. Lawrence, going to New York or Boston in that period. So it was only, in a sense, natural that after the famine, when the relatives of these people were forced to flee, they stuck on. For instance, in fact, one of the interesting things about it is that the small cottier class and the class above them of what were called the small farmers, they stayed on, they held on as long as they could, and then finally there was this almost kind of panic that took place. And people started leaving in droves. In 45, some 200,000 people. In 46, 400,000. By the end of the 50s, some 500,000 were leaving. And so by the end of the period between, say, 45 and 51, the 51 census, the population of Ireland dropped by clearly 3 million people. Now that's the countables, That's the people, for instance, who were counted in those censuses. And we know, for instance, for a fact that many, many people were not counted. Many of the laboring class. One of the Quakers, and the Quakers were incredibly good in terms of famine relief. They went in, they had soup kitchens all over the country, especially in the West and the Southwest, the hardest hit areas. And their soup kitchens were excellent. They were well manned, well organized. There just weren't enough of them. But they were there in large numbers, and the soup that they handed out was quite nutritious. You find, for instance, travelers describing what was being handed out to the starving population of the time from them. And from the British Association for the Relief of the Poor, there was another group from England itself that came over and operated soup kitchens. So you did have relief. And in fact, one of the ironies of the whole business of the famine was that all during the famine there was still lots of food in Ireland, but it was just getting the food to the people. That was the real problem. And they just, I mean, for instance, you look at the way in which the nationalists, the politicians of the 19th century used it. You can see why they used it and understand it. They used it for their own purposes to goad people into political action. And the rhetoric that they used suggested that there was practically a genocide, a planned genocide. Well, that is not true. The British may have had their bad sides, but one of the things was that there was no deliberate attempt to go in and starve the population. They just didn't know how to handle it. And I think, for instance, in our own time, of the way in which, for instance, the Red Cross has been hammered over AIDS, similar kind of thing. Something comes on, and we're only human, and we've got these organizations which are bureaucratic, and they're arthritic sometimes in their responses. It's not that any one person has evil intentions. It's just that it just happens too quickly, and you're not prepared for it. And that was exactly what happened, especially with relief measures in Britain, added to, of course, the ideology of free enterprise that was put in extreme form. The aftermath of the famine was that Ireland changed radically from what it had been before. The Irish language, one instance, for instance, of something that was happening already in Ireland and which got accelerated by the famine. In 1800, probably 50% of the population in Ireland spoke Irish, most of which was their only language. By the 1841 census, something like 25% of the population spoke Irish. And it's difficult to figure out what those statistics mean at times. Between the 1821 and 1831 census, for instance, in the town of Dundalk, 80% of the town of Dundalk in 1821 is Gaelic speaking. In 1831, only 40% is Irish speaking. Now, there was no famine in that period, and things were relatively good. Where did all those Gaelic speakers go? Where did all those Irish speakers go? And it's been suggested by Dermot O'Muircheartaigh, who was first chairholder of the Chair of Irish Studies at St. Mary's, who's done a study of the thing, that he said they probably were saying to the census takers when they asked that question about language, what language do they speak, they probably said, me English, me talk English. It was about all the English they could muster. But the decision had been made to go for English as the language of choice. And you know, despite the fact that Gaeilgeoirs in Ireland today would sort of, you know, feel, you know, they were disloyal to the language, these people, they were driven by economic necessity. There's no question about it. That it would be nice for them to hold on to Irish, but what was being said to them by the church especially and by the politicians like O'Connell was, what use is Irish to you? You know, you have to get out into an English-speaking world, and you'd better start learning English. There are many stories, for instance, told, and these could be repeated in our own area, especially, for instance, in Gaelic-speaking areas in Cape Breton, where Gaelic-speaking parents, monoglots, would punish their children when they came home from the national schools, which in the period of the 1830s excluded Irish from the teaching. When the national schools were set up, and this is an interesting thing too, the officialdom gave to the Irish the possibility of Gaelic being taught in the schools, and they rejected it. They said, no, we don't want Gaelic taught, we want English. And kids would come home from having learned or been taught in these schools, and they would start talking Irish naturally to their parents, and their parents would hit them, smack them. Speak English, talk English, you know. That was what they had to do. You know, they were sensible people. They realized, you know, that was the way it was going to be. That was the hard cultural facts of the situation. The other thing that's interesting about the change, for instance, or the circumstances of the Irish after the famine, of course, was that the land tenure system hadn't changed. You know, the famine didn't make one bit of difference in terms of that land holding situation. But what did change was the people who owned the land. Large tracts of land were sold. The ownership of that land was sold after the famine in what was called the Encumbered Estates Act. Many of the, as I mentioned, the landowners went bankrupt. And in the period from 1851 through to 1861, many of these encumbered estates were sold. And they were sold from, say, Cromwellian descendants who owned that land prior, you know, had had it for probably a century and a half or so, and they were sold to what in Ireland is called gombeen men, Irish middle-class Catholics who had the money. They went down and they bought the land, and they didn't really give a shite about the people on the land. In fact, they probably treat them, and we know for a fact they did treat them far worse than the old landlords. The old landlords were, in a term, I suppose, many of them gentlemen. They had a sense of noblesse oblige about the thing. Many of them did go bankrupt as a consequence of trying to handle the starving peasantry and their own indigency. But in that period, for instance, a huge chunk of the land in Ireland was transformed and taken over by these gombeen men, and the rents were even worse. The gouging was even worse, and as a consequence, more immigration, more people left. But the one thing that happened was that the Irish weren't stupid. The Irish peasantry holding that land, they realized if these landowners who had had it from time immemorial to their great-grandfather's time had suddenly lost it, the fellows who had just bought it could lose it just as easily. And so you found tremendous agitation in the period between 1861 and 1880 for a different system of land tenure. The pressure was such in the Irish countryside, and the politics of the period were such, that you gradually had a series of enactments put through by the British Parliament between 1861 and 1891, not a very long period, for people who were actually holding the land, or the actual tenants of the land, to buy the land back. And so by the end of the 19th century, the vast bulk of the land in Ireland was now owned by Irish people, the people whose ancestors had been tenants at will even of people only a generation and a half before, now became peasant proprietors. The situation, for instance, of peasant proprietorship was that you got, now these people had land in their hands, Remember our old Monsignor, you know, land, the greed for land was such, they didn't want to let it go. Now, in the 18th century and early part of the 19th century, when you had all this subdividing of land amongst people, the Irish married very early. They were very early marriers, 16, 17, 18 years of age. People would get half an acre of land, madly in love, get married, have a bunch of kids. And they lived happily. I mean, you see the description of the poverty. I mentioned last night de Lactane, for instance, this French traveler, who describes the hovels in which these people were living at the end of the 19th century in County Mayo. And then he says, and at night, he says, they gather at the crossroads, and the fiddle comes out, and the music starts, he says, and you see the dust, he said, under the feet, and they flying, shimmering just above the air as they dance. But that doesn't describe people who are suffering. I mean, they're having fun, you know. It just, again, is a question of how you define poverty. But that early marrying, which was a marked feature of the Irish population in the late 18th, early 19th century, changes dramatically at the end of the 19th century because the people who had land now wanted to hold it on and hold it in the family as long as they could and pass it on in the family, okay? And that meant, for instance, that if you had a woman or a man who had, say, 50 acres of land, a 50-acre farm, they wanted to make sure that it stayed in, you know, the McGuigan family name for forever. And so only one son would inherit that farm, the oldest son. And so he might be pretty long in the tooth before the ma and the da were put under the turf. And so he couldn't get married. And so because you couldn't invite a woman to marry you if you had no land, you didn't own anything, and she probably wouldn't want to get married. And so if she was smart, she got married to some young bucko in the place and took off to London or America or Canada or somewhere. And he ended up probably marrying a 20-year-old or 25-year-old when he was 55, like myself. And you see, so what happened was you had this brood of kids then would come out of this, and the old fellow would be gone very shortly, and the woman would hold on to the land till Jesus, she was long in the tooth, maybe 80 years of age. And what I mean, it's comic. It has its comic dimension, but it meant that Ireland had an incredibly low birth rate by the time the end of the century comes, where you had this incredibly high birth rate, say at the end of the 18th and early 19th century. And so the population starts going down, starts dwindling. You had emigration and low birth rates. And the other aspect of the thing, of course, was changes in attitude. In the 18th century, for instance, the generality of the Irish peasantry didn't own very much, and they didn't have much greed because they didn't have much. But as that farmer class becomes ensconced on the land between, say, 1861 and 1900, greed and middle-class morality and middle-class values start taking over. And you have a radical change in the way in which people looked at all sorts of things. They started becoming Victorian, you know. They started adopting all of the kind of puritanical modalities of Victorian life. The church becomes an extremely important part of life in the post-famine period. Whereas before the famine, and this is attested to by, for instance, the letter books of the bishops of Cashel, which still exist, Bishop Butler's letter books, saying that, you know, these people don't go to Mass. You know, they might go to the Pattern. You know, the Pattern was, of course, the festival day of the parish, when there was a fair and drinking and rowing and faction fighting and stuff. Lots of fun. They'd go to that, and they would go to the Holy Wells. They would go to the Holy Well in preference to coming to the chapel to go to Mass. They go to the Holy Well because it was what they'd always done. They'd done it in the 16th century and 17th century, and they were continuing to do it in the 18th century. The church was not very well organized because of the penal laws. At the end of the 19th century, the British government established Maynooth as a training ground for priests, not because they liked Catholic priests, but because they liked safe Catholic priests. They wanted people to be ordained as priests whom they could, in some senses, have a sense of security about. Because one of the travelers to Ireland, Alexis de Tocqueville, I don't know if any of you may be familiar with his travels in America, the Democracy in America. his description of America just before the Civil War. He did a tour in Ireland as well. And in his book on Ireland, he remarks, for instance, that he said, because he was coming from a Catholic country, France, well, semi-Catholic, I suppose, or quasi-Catholic, and he made remarks, for instance, that in Ireland, as distinct from France, he found that the lower clergy were radical in their politics, and the bishops extremely conservative, whereas in France, the priests were extremely conservative, and the bishops were incredibly liberal. And the reason for that was, you see, that most of the priests in Ireland in that period had been educated in France, in the French seminaries, and they'd been brought up, for instance, in the liberalism of the Enlightenment, liberal values, and the native bishops in Ireland, of course, were hand in glove with the authorities, and so the decision was made to support Maynooth. And in fact, one of the things which nearly brought down the British government in 1861 was the government upped the amount of money that were giving for the support of Maynooth to £290,000 a year to sustain the place. As I say, it almost brought down the British government, because you still had the old Protestant attitude towards Catholicism very deeply ingrained in the Protestant population in England at the time. So the church became very well organized. A daily attendance at Mass, confession, all of what we refer to as Puritan Catholicism starts taking over in Ireland, and you got, for the first time, a completely secular organization set up in Irish politics. And those were the things which came out of the failure of the repeal, Daniel O'Connell's big approach during the early part of the 19th century. First of all, he got Catholic emancipation in 1829, which liberated the middle-class Catholics from all the disabilities. They could go to, they become members of Parliament, they could stand before the law, they could, do all the professions were now open to them. And at the same time that the middle-class Catholics got this, the poor Catholics didn't even get the vote, because prior to 1829, the 20-shilling freeholders had the vote, which meant that probably something like 45% of the population in Ireland would have been able to vote, which would have included people as far down as the cottier class. People, for instance, who would have held 5 acres at the time would have been 20-shilling freeholders. But one of the deals that the British made with O'Connell, and I think he was right in some sense to make it, was that 20-shilling freeholders were excluded from the suffrage. Now it was the 40-shilling freeholders. And so a whole class of people for 3 generations were excluded from having a vote just by that thing in itself. So the pressure in the period after the famine was for some sense, for instance, of independence from Britain. O'Connell had tried the repeal. He had tried to repeal the Act of Union of 1801, and it had been met with a flat no by the British government. The only ones who voted for it in the English House of Commons, or the Westminster House, were the Irish members of Parliament under O'Connell. Every other member voted against it, and it was clear that O'Connell was not going to get it. His attempts, for instance, to bamboozle the British government into granting it by these huge monster meetings he held in the 1840s fizzled when the British banned the large monster meeting was holding in Clontarf in 1847, and he was forced. They said, if you come, we brought soldiers in, and he was afraid they were going to shoot on the crowd, and they probably would have. So it was disbanded, and he lost. And the younger members, people called the Young Irelanders, people like D'Arcy McGee, Gavin Duffy, who probably has cousins here tonight, Catherine, Gavin Duffy and others, they became convinced that the only way to get independence from Britain was by some kind of revolutionary means, by violent force. And so in the period after the famine, you get the foundation in the United States, St. Patrick's Day of 1856, the foundation of the Irish Republican Brotherhood, which was sworn to the physical force movement of getting independence from Britain. And so the whole course of Irish politics, right to this day, was determined as a consequence of the famine. The whole determination of people to use the gun to get back what the gun had, in a sense, taken from them. And you had, the foundation in the 1870s of the Irish Parliamentary Party under Parnell, which was the descendant of the old Parliamentary Party that O'Connell had headed. But Parnell was a much more sort of astute politician for the period he was in than O'Connell had been, and he brought forth a number of Home Rule bills for Ireland. And of course, each time that the Home Rule bills came up, they were defeated by the House of Lords. And so eventually you move over into our own century, and the IRB and its descendant, the IRA, have the Easter Rebellion of 1916, 1920, 1921, and the whole course, in the sense of Irish politics in our century, really pretty largely determined by the outcome of the famine itself. I'll leave it there. If you have some questions, I mean, I know that these things get wearying at night, but if you feel like throwing some questions at me, I'll try to answer them for you. But thank you very much for your attendance.
Questions? Just one, Dr. Byrne. Have you been to Maynooth College?
Yes. Yes.
I was just wondering, do they have any pictures or charcoal sketches of the priests that were ordained there in the early years, say, in the early 1800s, mid-1800s?
There may be. I'm not familiar with them. The question is if there are any sketches of the priests who were ordained from Maynooth, if there are any sketches of them in the college from the period of the 1820s.
Yeah, I was just wondering, like our renowned Father Duffy here in Payne, he was a graduate from Maynooth College.
I doubt that there would be, but it's possible. You didn't really get photography didn't come in until much later in the century, and unless you were fairly grand, you didn't have your likeness done. The closest thing you get probably for poorer people would be the what were they called? The black profile, silhouette drawings. Sometimes they would be done, but generally speaking, I don't think you would find that. There might be a later. When did Father Duffy die?
1860.
It's possible there might be a picture of him, a daguerreotype or something like that around, but I don't think there would probably be anything in Maynooth. Maynooth, of course, today it was the great sort of training seminary for Irish priests up until about 25 years ago. It was secularized, and it's now horror of horrors to the clerics, co-educational. There are women in there, God, coming to.
Those books that you referred to there, parish books that they got.
The parish registers?
Yes.
Yes.
Would they be all over Ireland the same?
No, that's an interesting question for genealogical purposes, because of for a variety of reasons. Irish parish registers, some of them which would have been kept from, say, I think, the middle years of the 18th century on, in a lot of parishes, seem to have disappeared. For the generality of Irish parish registers don't start until after emancipation in 1829. Dublin, Cork, Limerick, Waterford, Wexford town, these are towns. You find records going back, in one instance, for instance, Wexford, the records in Wexford town go back to the late 17th century, 1690s. For Waterford, St. Patrick starts 1706. Limericks start in the 1750s, 1760s. Cork's roughly the same period. But for a lot of the rural parishes, you don't find records, registers starting until sometimes as late as the 1860s. Now, again, there's a variety of explanations for it. I've come across references, for instance, to no longer existent parish registers in Spain. Spanish, for instance, there's a series of documents that were edited by a woman called Micheline Walsh. In fact, some of you may know Dick Walsh, Dick's former wife, did these. She went down to the Spanish archives, and they're called Irish Knights or Spanish Knights of Irish origin. And in these things, they wanted to have some kind of ennoblement, people making appeals for some kind of ennoblement, be called a don. Right? So they had to give a genealogy of the family and trace it back. So they were writing back to Ireland, and in these things there are documents, for instance, from a priest in a parish in Care, saying, as it appears in the Register of Care, giving the parents of this person from 1734. Well, there's no records in Care that start earlier than 1770 now. So what happened to those books? They may have been destroyed in a fire. They may have been brought to Spain. In fact, I suspect sometime, as people keep going through these massive archives, that someone's going to find, a couple of these registers which were brought over by priests coming out from Ireland. They take the register with them. And that's not unheard of. It's happened in Ireland itself. And of course, I had a horror story happen to run to my ears. I was looking some years ago for the parish registers in Thomastown, Kilkenny, and they start in 1786 now. And Canon Power, who was the parish priest, a marvelous old man, he had started copying out the barely legible registers on cards of all the records. He was quite an old man when he started doing this, and he'd copied the whole of the registers out on these cards in marvelous fashion. And he said, Mr. Byrne, he says, I was here as a curate. Now, this is about almost 80 years of age. I was here as a young curate, he said. And there were 2 books here, he said, before this, but they're gone, he says. And I think, he says, the old canon burnt them. Yeah, it's one of these situations, that they didn't take care of the records very well sometimes.
Anyone else?
Yes.
Gary?
Is there any sense of an effect on the British, by the way, the national guilt over famine, tragedy? I mean, I think about you trying to read that passage and not that the same effect on me trying to read some of the accounts. And there was a British civil service in place at the time. There were people there that must have seen this for themselves.
Yes.
I would think that would have...
Oh, yeah. I mean, there were lots of people, individually, there wasn't any kind of national guilt about it, because you really, in some senses, didn't have, the kind of media to bring it to people's attention in quite the same way. But there were lots of people in England, particularly, for instance, from the liberal side of the society, who were absolutely horrified by the famine, And they were the people who started to try to make relief efforts in Ireland in the famine, say, of 46 and 47, and the years subsequent to that. But of course, you had similar kinds of conditions. You had famines of this sort in Ireland, but the English peasantry were no better off in many respects than the Irish peasantry. They were treated as bad by their landlords as the Irish were by theirs. It was just the tenor of the times, horrible as it may seem. And as Young says, they weren't as well fed either, But there were, for instance, the famine was very, very much covered by the London newspapers of the time. And in fact, if you may have seen books on the famine, and there are some nice lithographs in all of the London illustrated magazines for 45, 46, and 47 of scenes from the famine and reports from the famine. And there were people like the Quakers, the independent Protestant denominations, who did bring this to people's attention and who tried to raise monies for famine relief. in fact, one of the interesting things about the famine relief and this Catholic Protestant thing, in Irish folklore, one of the stories you pick up all over the country, and it's a piece of folklore, but you find it that the story goes, and all of these were collected in the Irish language. You have someone dying in a cabin, right? And the Protestant minister comes in and pokes a half-crown under the pillow or whatever the person is lying on, you see. And you want to sort of, does it surreptitiously. And the Catholic priest comes in to do his ministrations, and he pokes around and takes it out. And you find all over the country these stories. To what extent that was done, I don't know, but it does indicate, you know, the way people looked at things. They did. The only Protestants who really came off badly in the famine were the Anglicans, the Church of Ireland people, because they set up soup kitchens where you could only get the soup if you accepted religion with it. And these people in Ireland are called the soupers. The people, the descendants, the Irish descendants who took the soup and became Protestant were referred to as supers. Not a nice name to call somebody. In fact, I have a good friend in Halifax who's a descendant of a super, and any time I get mad with him, I say, "Ah, you bloody super." He's a good fellow, though. We'll get him one day. Yes?
In terms of an annual income for a family, can you give us any idea of how much it would cost a typical family to emigrate, to book passage to the New World in the 1840s and 50s?
Yeah, that's an interesting question in itself, too, because there were two rates. The reason why a lot of famine immigrants came into St. John and St. Andrews in New Brunswick was that in these assisted emigrations that were going on in the period, emigration to British North America, which was what's now Canada, would be, say, roughly £2, okay, £2 for the passage over. And for, you know, it would be less for children, especially if you're going steerage or even on deck in some instances. But if you were going to the U.S., it was £5. So what they did, they would come over to St. John or to St. Andrews, and of course walk across into the States. They might have had relatives down there. Or they would stay, for instance, in Halifax or St. John, or maybe even Charlottetown, and work for, say, 2 or 3 years to get enough money so that they could go down into the States, or go to Quebec, or Montreal, or Toronto, you know, or somewhere into the center of the country. So it was cheaper to come into British North America through assisted emigration, and then make your way down to where you wanted to go, where you're headed for.
The people that came into Bronxtown or Quebec,
Mm-hmm.
do they have records from whence they came, or would there be any records on people like that?
Not
Or
much.
just the lowest of the peasantry, just kind of word bones that were treated so badly there in Bronxtown?
Pretty generally, there are no records. There are very, very few records of there are some, but you know, nothing like you'd like to have for the immigrants coming in. Some burial records, burial registers, this sort of thing. But that's a real, you know, it's too bad, for instance, in terms of the immigration to this area, that so few passenger lists were kept. There were passenger lists required. The Passenger Act, for instance, of 1821 required the passenger list to be kept for all ships, passenger crew list. Some of these survive, but not many for those ships, because a lot of them were operating almost illegally. You know, there were old hulks that people bought, and they're just made, again, you know, whenever you have misery, you know, you have people who want to make money on it. And you had loads of people who wanted to make money on the famine immigrants, or the famine misery, you know. People who would pay their life savings, for instance, to get down to Cork, to get out. You know, they may have had 5